The storm had begun as a soft, almost innocent drizzle, but within minutes it transformed into a monster that seemed determined to tear the small town apart. The wind howled as if it carried centuries of anger inside it, and the windows of Margaret's old house trembled with every blow. It was a night crafted for fear, one of those nights when the outside world feels hostile and the quiet of one's home becomes a fragile but sacred refuge. Margaret was accustomed to silence. Since her husband passed away 3 years ago, every night had become an exercise in endurance, a dialogue between her breathing and the darkness surrounding her. The storm didn't help. The thunder felt like it was crashing directly over her roof, and the lightning cast quick flashes through the empty hallways, reminding her that no one walked beside her anymore. It was during one of those flashes that she heard the knocks, 3 of them, strong, urgent. Not the fickle tapping of the wind. These were human knocks. Someone was at her door. For a moment her heart stopped obeying her. In such a small town, on such a violent night, who could possibly need to enter her home, and why hers? The idea of opening the door to a stranger terrified her. But the knocks continued, weaker this time, as if the strength on the other side was fading. With trembling hands, she grabbed the oil lamp and approached the door. It shook with each gust of wind. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling fear and determination twist inside her. She turned the lock. When she opened it, the figure standing before her looked like a ghost dragged out of the storm. An older man, soaked from head to toe, his clothes clinging to his body and his green jacket dripping as if he had crossed an entire ocean. His hands trembled, but not from the cold. It was a tremble born from a place beyond the body, the tremble of the soul. He lifted his gaze, and that was the moment Margaret understood everything without him saying a word. His eyes, deeply wrinkled and weary, held a history of battles that never made it into books. They were eyes that had seen too much, lost too much, carried too much. Not the eyes of a wanderer, but the eyes of someone who had once been a soldier, someone who had survived far more than he should have. "Good evening," he murmured, his voice cracked as if unused for days. He tried to stand straight, but his legs wavered just enough to betray him. The man was exhausted, almost defeated. Margaret hesitated. Every logical thought in her mind told her to close the door or to call someone else. Who was he? What did he want? Why did his gaze carry an entire world of wounds? But something stronger than reason spoke first. That human instinct that awakens when you see true vulnerability before you, not a threat, but a silent plea from someone who no longer has the strength to ask for help. "Come in," she finally said, her voice steadier than she expected. She stepped back to let him in. The veteran crossed the threshold with the clumsiness of someone who had walked too long under the rain and far too long under the weight of his memories. When she closed the door behind him, the storm remained outside. But the presence of the man made it clear that another storm, an older, deeper one, had just entered her home with him. Margaret didn't know it yet, but that decision, to invite him in, would change the night, the morning, and the course of her entire destiny. The oil lamp flickered as the man stepped inside, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Margaret watched him quietly, unsure whether to speak or simply allow him time to breathe. He stood motionless for a few seconds, as if trying to remember what it felt like to be indoors, sheltered, safe. Then, slowly, almost painfully, he lowered his soaked bag to the floor. The green jacket he wore was unmistakable, not the fashionable kind, not something one buys from a store out of preference. This was a jacket made for survival. Heavy, faded, frayed along the seams. A jacket that had weathered cold nights, foreign lands and long marches. A jacket that did not belong to the present, but to a distant battlefield. Margaret's eyes lingered on the way he held himself, shoulders slightly hunched, breath uneven, gaze drifting toward the corners of the room as if scanning for threats no one else could see. The war had ended decades ago, and yet it still lived inside him, moving through his thoughts like a shadow that refused to leave. "Sit, please," she said gently, pointing toward the wooden chair beside the fireplace. He hesitated before obeying, as though he feared he might be imposing, as though sitting might break some unspoken rule he had carried for too long. Finally, he lowered himself into the chair, the old wood creaking under his tired weight. The fire crackled softly, warming the chill that clung to him. He held his hands close to the flames, but even Margaret could see they weren't shaking from cold alone. The tremor was deeper, rooted somewhere memory refuses to let go of. "Thank you," he whispered. It was only 2 words, but they carried the heaviness of a man who had not been welcomed, invited, or cared for in a very long time. Margaret prepared a towel, handing it to him. As he dried his face, she noticed the fine network of scars across his knuckles, small, faded, but unmistakable. They weren't the marks of someone who worked with tools or machines. They were the marks of someone who had fought for his life again and again. "You're a veteran," she said softly, more a realization than a question. He paused, towel still in his hands, and for a moment Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Then he nodded once. "World War II," he murmured. "Infantry." The words slipped out with the weight of a confession, a simple truth that carried a lifetime of untold pain. Margaret felt her heart tighten. Her husband had never served, but she remembered the stories the older men in town used to tell. The nightmares, the sudden silences, the way some of them never truly returned home even after stepping off the ship. "You must be cold," she said, not wanting to pry deeper into wounds she didn't yet understand. "Let me make some tea." While she worked in the kitchen, she noticed how quiet he remained, almost too quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of someone who has learned to shrink himself so he doesn't disturb the world around him. Someone who has carried solitude for so long it has become a second skin. But she also noticed something else. Whenever he thought she wasn't looking, he glanced toward the front door, not fearfully, instinctively. His eyes tracked the shadows, the wind's movement outside, the faint rattle of the window pane. Every sound triggered a calculation in his mind. Every silence made him listen harder. It was then Margaret understood. He wasn't simply tired, he wasn't simply lost. He was a man who had never stopped surviving, a man whose battle had never truly ended. And somehow, on this night of all nights, that battle had led him to her door. The tea kettle whistled softly, its warm sound strangely comforting against the relentless pounding of the storm. Margaret poured 2 cups, her hands steady, even though her mind was still tangled in questions. She didn't know the man's name, where he had come from, or why he had been walking through such violent weather. But something told her that what mattered most wasn't the answers. It was the ache behind his silence, the kind that spoke louder than any explanation. When she returned to the living room, the veteran was seated exactly as she had left him, staring into the fire as though it held a memory only he could see. The flames reflected in his eyes, but the expression behind them seemed miles away. "Here," she said gently, handing him a cup. He accepted it with both hands, the steam rising between them like a fragile bridge. He didn't drink immediately. Instead, he inhaled the warmth as if reminding his body what comfort felt like. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The storm carried on with its fury outside, but inside the house, a strange stillness settled, a stillness that wasn't empty, but full of things unspoken. Margaret sat across from him. She didn't want to intrude on his silence, yet she wanted to understand it. She had seen grief before, and loneliness, and exhaustion, but there was something different about the way he sat there. Something fractured, something haunted. Her eyes drifted to the small worn bag at his feet. It was old, too old, and she wondered what kind of relics a man carried after decades of running from memories. Letters, photos, medals, or nothing at all. A sudden flash of lightning made him flinch, barely, but enough for someone who was paying attention. His fingers tightened around the cup as though bracing for impact. Margaret noticed. "You're safe here," she said softly. He blinked, as if waking from a distant world. "I know," he replied, not convincingly. He took a slow sip of tea, his hands trembling just enough to reveal what he tried to hide. Margaret hesitated before speaking again. "Has it been a long night?" He huffed a quiet, tired breath. "It's been a long life, ma'am." She didn't smile. His words weren't meant as a joke. After another pause, he finally looked around the room, noticing the framed photographs on the mantelpiece. Margaret's wedding picture stood at the center, her late husband in his Sunday suit, smiling kindly at the camera. The veteran's eyes softened, then clouded over with something that looked like grief or guilt. "He was your husband," he said quietly. "Yes," Margaret replied. "He passed 3 years ago." The veteran swallowed hard. It wasn't just sympathy in his expression, it was recognition, as though loss was the one language he still understood fluently. "I'm sorry," he murmured. She nodded. "Thank you." He held her gaze for a moment, and in that brief exchange, she saw him crack, not in a way that made him fragile, but in a way that revealed the truth. He too had buried someone he loved, maybe more than one, maybe dozens. There are people who speak their stories, and there are people whose stories bleed through their silence. The veteran was the latter. Margaret leaned slightly forward, her voice gentle. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but if there's something you need to say, I'll listen." He looked down at his cup, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, Margaret thought he wouldn't respond. Then, very faintly, his lips parted. "I used to have a place to go," he whispered, almost to himself. "People to return to." He stared into the fire again. "Now it's just me." Those 4 words carried the weight of a lifetime. Outside, thunder shook the sky. Inside, the silence between them cracked open. Not frightening, not uncomfortable, but honest. And in that honesty, Margaret realized why she wasn't afraid of him. Because she recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look she saw in herself every morning. The fire had settled into a steady glow, no longer fighting the dampness that clung to the air, but embracing it. Soft, warm, patient. Margaret watched the veteran as he sat across from her, his posture rigid at first, then slowly sinking into the fragile comfort the house offered. There was something vulnerable about a man who seemed built for endurance, finally allowing himself to rest. Outside, the storm intensified, lightning slicing through the sky, thunder cracking like artillery fire. Margaret saw the way he tensed each time, just slightly, as if his body still believed it was on a battlefield and the world might fall apart at any moment. She wanted to say something comforting, but she sensed the wrong words could shut him down. Instead, she poured him a little more tea. He set his cup aside and stared into the flames again. The light flickered across his face, revealing deeper lines, older wounds. The war had marked him far beyond the skin. "You said earlier, Nat, you used to have people to return to," Margaret said gently. "What happened to them?" He didn't answer right away. His chest rose and fell with a slow, heavy breath, the kind a man takes when he's deciding whether or not to reopen a door he's kept locked for decades. "When I came back from Europe," he said finally, his voice gravelly, "I thought life would go back to what it was. Thought I'd step off that train, put down my duffel and pick up where I left off." His eyes glistened, not with tears, but with memory. But I wasn't the same, and they weren't the same with me. Margaret listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. "I married," he continued. "Had a little boy. For a while it felt like I'd outrun the worst of it. But the nightmares—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I'd wake up swinging, screaming sometimes. My wife, she tried. God knows she tried. But after a few years, she couldn't take it anymore." "What happened to her?" Margaret asked softly. "She left," he said, voice barely audible. "Took our son. Can't blame her for protecting him. A man who comes home in one piece isn't always whole on the inside." He rubbed his palms together, as though trying to warm something deeper than skin. "I wrote letters," he said, "every month, sometimes twice. Never got a reply." Margaret felt her heart ache for him. A different kind of war, one fought in bedrooms, kitchens, and quiet nights, had taken the rest of what the battlefield hadn't. The fire popped sharply, and he startled again. "I'm sorry," he muttered, embarrassed. "You don't have to apologize," Margaret said. "Not for that." He gave her a sad smile, small, fleeting, but real. Another rumble of thunder shook the roof. The house trembled. and Margaret instinctively pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The veteran glanced toward the windows, scanning the darkness beyond them. She noticed something then. He wasn't just reacting to the storm. He was monitoring it, measuring the threat, keeping watch. Old habits, old instincts. The instincts of a man who had once been responsible for others' survival. "Does the storm remind you of—" Margaret began, unsure how to finish the sentence. He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw the full truth, not just pain, but exhaustion, deeper than she had imagined. "Everything does," he said. "Storms, loud noises, silence, even kindness." He exhaled shakily. "When you've seen what I've seen, ma'am, sometimes the world feels like a place you're just visiting, not a place you live in." Margaret swallowed hard. She knew grief intimately, but this man's grief was rooted in something she couldn't fully comprehend, something that had taken his family, his peace, and even his sense of belonging. "You can stay here tonight," she said softly. "You don't have to go back out there." He nodded slowly. "Thank you. Truly." The fire crackled. The storm roared. And between them sat two people who had both lost parts of themselves the world could not see. Two people who, by nothing more than fate and a knock on a door, were beginning to feel less alone. Margaret wasn't a woman who shared her pain easily. Most people in town thought of her as quiet, polite, a little withdrawn since her husband's passing, but always composed. What they didn't know was that composure was her armor. Grief had taught her to be silent, to shrink her feelings so they wouldn't overflow and drown her. She lived in a house full of memories she didn't dare disturb, because if she did, everything she had been holding together so carefully might collapse. But tonight, as the storm raged outside and a wounded stranger sat across from her, Margaret felt something shift. There is a particular kind of honesty that only emerges when two people recognize the pain in each other without having to explain it. The veteran's stories, broken, incomplete, heavy, had opened a door inside her she had kept, locked for years. She took a slow breath, wrapping her shawl more tightly around herself. The fire cast a warm glow on her face, softening the lines that grief had carved there. "You've carried a lot," she said to him gently. "More than most." He didn't respond, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in the way he lowered his gaze. She hesitated before continuing. "But you're not the only one with ghosts." The veteran looked up, and for the first time, she saw not just exhaustion in his eyes, but curiosity, interest, as though he had expected every burden in the room to be his own. Margaret took her teacup, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. "My husband, he was a good man, steady, kind. He worked the land since he was a boy. He never raised his voice, not once in the 30 years we were married." Her voice wavered just slightly. "But cancer doesn't care how good a man is." The veteran's expression softened. "He passed quietly," Margaret continued. "But the quiet afterward was so loud I could barely breathe in this house." She looked toward the hallway where his boots had once echoed every morning. "I used to talk to him after he died," she confessed. "Only when I was sure no one could hear. Just little things. About the day, about the chickens, the weather. I told myself it helped. Maybe it did. Maybe it just kept me from falling apart." The veteran's brow furrowed in understanding, a subtle nod encouraging her to continue. "When he was gone," she said, her voice quieter now, "I stopped opening the curtains, stopped going out at night, stopped answering the door." She managed a fragile smile. "Tonight is the first time in months I've opened it for anyone." The veteran swallowed, visibly moved. "Why me?" he asked softly. She looked at him for a long moment, at his worn jacket, his trembling hands, the storm still echoing in his eyes. "Because you looked like you needed someone to open a door for you," she answered. "And maybe—" her voice caught. "Maybe I needed that too." The room fell silent again, but this silence was different from before. It wasn't heavy or tense or filled with unspoken fear. It was shared, gentle, a quiet place where two wounded lives briefly overlapped. The fire crackled, thunder rolled, and Margaret felt for the first time in years that she wasn't alone inside her grief. There was another person in the room who understood what it meant to lose pieces of yourself without ever knowing how to get them back. "Sometimes," she said, staring into the flames, "I think loneliness is its own kind of war, a slow one, a silent one." The veteran nodded, a profound, almost sorrowful agreement settling over his features. "Yes," he murmured, "and not everyone survives it." Margaret looked at him then, really looked, and realized that the man sitting across from her wasn't just someone who had survived a war. He was someone who had survived the aftermath, and in that moment, without saying it aloud, both of them understood something simple and life-changing. Tonight they were no longer fighting alone. The storm outside showed no sign of mercy. The wind clawed at the walls, howling through the eaves as if begging to be let in. Rain hammered the windows so fiercely that Margaret wondered if the glass could withstand another hour. Yet inside the house, the warmth of the fire and the raw honesty between them had created a fragile sanctuary, one built not of bricks and wood, but of shared pain. That sanctuary shattered in an instant. It began with the veteran's eyes shifting, not dramatically, not in panic, but with a sudden sharpened alertness. He wasn't looking at her or the fire. His gaze had drifted past her shoulder, toward the front window. Margaret felt the air tighten. "Is everything all right?" she asked, noticing the way his body stiffened. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly rose from his chair, movements controlled, deliberate. The same movements of a man who had once waited for danger in the shadows of a foreign battlefield. Margaret followed his gaze. For a moment she saw nothing, just the black curtain of night streaked by rain, illuminated occasionally by flashes of lightning. But then, in one of those flashes, she saw it. A silhouette, a tall, hunched figure standing impossibly close to the window, so close the storm's fury seemed to break around it instead of swallowing it. The light illuminated its shape for just a second, but that second was enough. Margaret gasped and stumbled back. The veteran didn't move from his position. He didn't flinch, he didn't blink. His eyes locked on the window with the same intensity of someone assessing a threat, calculating distance, analyzing intent. "Turn off the lamp," he said quietly, but with authority. Margaret obeyed immediately, reaching for the oil lamp and extinguishing it. The room was plunged into darkness except for the dim firelight. The veteran took another step toward the window. "Stay behind me." His voice wasn't loud, but it held a kind of weight Margaret hadn't heard before, firm, protective, commanding. It was the voice of a man who had led others through situations far worse than this. Who is out there?" she whispered, her breath trembling. "Someone who shouldn't be," he said softly. Lightning cracked again and the silhouette moved, just a shift of posture but unmistakable. It wasn't the storm playing tricks. Someone was out there, someone watching. Margaret's heart pounded. "Is it an animal? A person?" He didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, Margaret sensed he did, but because naming it out loud would make it real. Another flash, another glimpse. This time she noticed more. The broad shoulders, the angled head, the way the figure leaned forward as if listening. A man she did not recognize. The veteran's jaw tightened. "He's been standing there longer than we realized." "How can you tell?" "His posture," he murmured. "He's not startled by the lightning. He's waiting for something." Margaret felt cold seep into her bones. Why would someone be here during a storm like this? The veteran didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer to the window, stepping with the caution of someone trained to avoid revealing his position. His hand hovered near the heavy iron poker by the fireplace, a makeshift weapon, but a weapon nonetheless. The rain intensified, drumming harder against the glass. The figure outside shifted again, closer this time. So close, Margaret imagined. She could hear his breath against the pane. "Back away from the window," the veteran ordered softly. She did. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the sky, masking the sound of something else. Footsteps on wet ground. "He's moving," the veteran said, voice barely above a whisper. "Toward the door." A pause. "No, around the side of the house." Margaret's stomach dropped. The back door, the one near the kitchen, had an old latch that sometimes stuck. She'd meant to fix it months ago. She never imagined she'd need to. "Lock every door," the veteran said, his voice calm but urgent. "Right now." Margaret hurried toward the hallway, pulse racing. The storm was no longer the danger. Someone outside had chosen this night, this house, this moment. And Margaret suddenly understood why the veteran had looked at the windows earlier, why he had listened so intently to every shift of wind and rain. He wasn't paranoid, he wasn't imagining things. He had sensed this. And the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just entered her life. Margaret moved through the hallway as quickly as she could, her heart pounding with every step. The old wooden floors creaked beneath her weight, each sound echoing louder than it ever had before. She reached the back door and fumbled with the latch, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the metal bar. Finally, click, she secured it. But the sense of safety it should have brought never arrived. She turned to return to the living room, but before she could take 2 steps, she froze. A voice drifted in from outside. Low, male, muffled by the storm, but unmistakably real. "Margaret!" Her blood ran cold. She recognized it. "Oh no," she whispered, barely able to breathe. The veteran, still in the living room, heard her reaction and immediately stepped toward the hallway. "You know him?" Margaret swallowed hard, every muscle in her body shaking. "Yes." The voice came again, closer this time, as if circling the back of the house. "Marguerite, open up. I know you're in there." The veteran's expression sharpened. "Who is he?" "A man from town," she said, her voice shaking. "A troublemaker. He's come around before. He watches my house sometimes. Shows up at the store when I'm alone." The veteran's jaw tightened with a quiet, unspoken anger. "Why didn't you tell someone?" "I tried," she whispered. "The sheriff said he couldn't do anything unless the man actually broke in, and he never did." She closed her eyes for a moment, trembling. "Until now." The veteran nodded once, calm, focused, determined, a soldier at the edge of a battlefield. Lightning flashed, illuminating the back window for a split second, and there he was. The man, tall, unkempt, soaked to the bone, with wild eyes and the unmistakable posture of someone who no longer cared about consequences. He slammed his fist against the glass. Margaret gasped. "Don't you walk away from me," he shouted through the storm. The veteran grabbed her arm gently, but firmly. "Get behind me." Thunder shook the sky, but the man's voice cut through it. "You think you can ignore me forever? You think I don't know you're alone in there?" Another blow to the window, this one harder. The glass shuddered. The veteran positioned himself between Margaret and the door, scanning the room for anything he could use. His eyes landed on the iron fireplace poker. He grabbed it immediately. "Call the sheriff," he said. "I tried once before," she whispered. "During another night. They took so long, he was gone by the time they arrived." "Well, he won't be gone this time," the veteran said, his voice firm. A shadow passed the kitchen window again. The man was moving, searching for a way in, testing weaknesses. The veteran inhaled deeply, not in fear but in preparation. Margaret recognized that breath. It was the breath of someone stepping into danger knowingly, willingly, because someone else needed protecting. He turned to her. "Where else can he get in?" "The cellar door," she said. "On the side of the house." "Is it locked?" I don't know." The veteran didn't hesitate. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't make a sound." Margaret reached for his arm, her voice breaking. "Please, don't confront him alone." He met her eyes with a steadiness she hadn't seen in anyone for years. "Mom," he said quietly, "I've seen men like him before. If he gets inside, he won't stop until he gets what he wants." He tightened his grip on the poker. "I won't let that happen." Before she could protest, he moved toward the back of the house. Silent, deliberate steps, every muscle of his aging body remembering what it meant to protect, to shield, to stand between danger and the innocent. Margaret followed him only with her eyes, her breath caught in her throat. The storm roared. The man outside snarled, and the veteran stepped into the darkness, because whatever hunted Margaret tonight was no longer just her fear. It had become his mission. The veteran stepped, into the back corridor with the same quiet precision he had once used in ruined European villages under enemy fire. His boots barely made a sound on the old wooden floor, every sense sharpened, every instinct awakening, as if decades had not passed since he last prepared for danger. Outside, the storm raged louder, but beneath its roar, he could hear what Margaret could not, the deliberate crunch of footsteps in the mud circling the house, the slow, predatory pacing of a man who believed he had found his prey. The veteran reached the side window just in time to catch sight of the intruder moving toward the cellar door. The man pulled at the handle, testing it. When it didn't budge, he cursed loudly and began searching for a loose board or weakness in the foundation. The veteran tightened his grip on the iron poker. It wasn't a rifle, but he had fought with less. In the war, sometimes survival came down to one thing: the will to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. And tonight, that someone was Margaret. "Stay away from her," he whispered under his breath, not to the intruder, but to himself, grounding his purpose the way he had done countless times before. Lightning illuminated the yard, and for a brief second, the intruder turned, scanning the windows with wild, desperate eyes. The veteran stepped back into the shadows, breath even, expression calm. He wasn't afraid. He simply didn't intend to give the man the advantage. The intruder stomped toward the back porch again, anger growing like heat. "Margaret!" he screamed over the storm. "You think a locked door is going to keep me out?" The veteran moved silently toward the back door, positioning himself between it and the kitchen. He tested the old hinges. They rattled. Not good. One hard shove and the intruder could force his way inside. He glanced toward the hallway where Margaret stood, pale, trembling, watching him. "Go into the living room," he instructed firmly. "Stay low. Stay out of sight." She shook her head. I can't leave you." "You're not leaving me," he said, voice steady and calm. "You're giving me room to work." Something in his tone, authority, experience, unshakable resolve, finally convinced her. She retreated into the living room, crouching behind the heavy sofa, barely able to breathe. The veteran returned his focus to the door. The footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate. The shadow grew larger across the frosted glass. The intruder jiggled the knob violently, then slammed, his shoulder against the wood. The old frame groaned. The veteran raised the poker. Another slam. The glass cracked. A final enraged roar, and the intruder threw himself against the door with all his weight. The latch snapped. The door burst open. Before the man could take a full step inside, the veteran moved, not with the speed of a young soldier, but with the precision of a man who had survived by acting before thinking. He struck the intruder's forearm with the poker, forcing him back, then stepped forward with surprising strength for his age. The intruder stumbled, cursing, grabbing for balance. "You picked the wrong house," the veteran growled. The man swung at him wildly, but the veteran deflected it, hitting him square in the ribs. Years of battle-honed instinct guided every movement. He didn't hesitate, didn't overthink. He simply acted. The intruder lunged again, grabbing the veteran's collar, trying to drag him outside. They struggled on the slippery porch, feet slipping on. Rain-soaked wood. The veteran pushed back, using his weight strategically, driving the man into the railing with a hard thud. Lightning flashed, revealing the intruder's twisted expression, rage mixed with fear. He hadn't expected a frail old man to fight. He certainly hadn't expected him to win. The veteran lifted the poker again, stopping only when the man raised his hands defensively, gasping, all right, I'm leaving." "Go," the veteran commanded, panting, "and don't come back." The intruder, soaked and humiliated, stumbled down the steps and disappeared into the storm, running like a coward who had discovered he was not the predator he imagined. The veteran stood there, breathing heavily, gripping the railing to steady himself. The storm soaked him instantly, but he didn't move, not until he was sure the danger had fully passed. Only then did he turn back inside. Margaret rushed toward him, tears streaming down her face, a mixture of terror, relief, and overwhelming gratitude. The veteran raised a hand gently. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe." But as Margaret embraced him, she felt the truth beneath his steady tone. He wasn't just protecting her, he was fighting the war all over again. For a long moment, the only sound inside the house was Margaret's uneven breathing as she clung to the veteran's damp jacket. The storm still raged outside, thunder rolling across the sky like distant artillery. But inside the walls of her home, a different kind of silence took root, one thick with relief, disbelief, and a gratitude she had no words for. The veteran stood still, letting her hold on to him. His breathing was heavy but controlled, the way someone breathes after forcing their body to do more than it was built for. The firelight shimmered across his rain-soaked jacket as he gently lowered the iron poker onto the table. "You're all right," he murmured, steadying her with both hands. But Margaret shook her head, tears falling freely now. "No, you saved me. If you hadn't been here—" He stopped her with a quiet shake of his head. "Ma'am, I only did what anyone should have done." "No," she insisted, looking up into his tired, gentle eyes. "Not anyone would have. Not anyone could have." He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back slightly as if unsure he deserved her gratitude. Margaret saw the way he held himself, shoulders squared, posture rigid, not in pride, but in restraint, like a man afraid to take up too much space, afraid to claim something he didn't believe he had earned. She guided him toward the sofa. "Sit, please, you're exhausted." He sat reluctantly, wiping rain from his face with trembling fingers. The tremble wasn't from cold. Margaret knew that now. It was the tremble of adrenaline fading, of memories resurfacing, of a man who'd stepped back into the one place he had spent decades trying to escape, the battlefield of fear. Margaret knelt beside him. "Are you hurt?" "No," he said softly. "Just tired." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on a fresh scrape along his forearm. She walked to the kitchen and returned with a small cloth and warm water. He watched her, confused. "You don't have to—" "I know," she replied. "But let me." She cleaned the scrape gently, and he winced, not from pain but from the unfamiliarity of being cared for. It had been so long since anyone had tended to him that the simple touch felt foreign, almost overwhelming. "You shouldn't have to deal with people like him alone," the WWII veteran said quietly. Margaret looked down. "I didn't think anyone would help me. People saw him around the house. Some warned me he was trouble, but no one ever stepped in." "Well," the veteran murmured, "you're not alone tonight." She felt her throat tighten. Those 6 words carried more comfort than any she'd heard in years. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room. The veteran leaned back on the sofa, eyes closing for a moment. Not in sleep, but in surrender. A small, fleeting moment of peace crossed his features. Margaret sat beside him. "Why did you do it?" she whispered. "You could have been hurt." His eyes opened slowly, meeting hers with a depth she didn't expect. "Because danger doesn't scare me anymore," he said. "But losing someone who doesn't deserve harm—" He hesitated. "That scares me more than anything." Margaret felt tears rise again. But not from fear this time, from recognition, from connection, from something she hadn't felt since her husband died, the sense of being protected. The veteran looked away, almost embarrassed by his own admission. "I'm not a hero, ma'am. I'm just a man who's tired of watching the world take good people down. And I'm just a woman who hasn't felt safe in a very long time," she whispered. They sat there side by side, listening to the storm soften outside. The thunder grew distant, the rain lighter. The world, for the first time in hours, seemed to exhale. Margaret looked at the man beside her. This wandering veteran, this stranger whose silence spoke of unimaginable pain, whose courage had saved her life. Tonight had brought them together by accident, but the connection forming between them, that was no accident at all. By the time the storm finally began to break, the sky outside had softened into a bruised shade of grey-blue. The rain tapered into a quiet drizzle, and the thunder rolled away like a retreating army. Inside the house, the fire had burned low, but its glow still warmed the room where Margaret and the veteran sat side by side, wrapped in a silence that no longer felt heavy or frightening. It felt safe. Margaret rose only when she noticed the veteran's wet clothes still clinging to him. "You'll catch your death sitting like that," she murmured gently. "Let me get you something dry to wear." He attempted a tired smile. "I'll be all right." "No," she said softly, her voice warm but firm. "You won't. Not unless you take care of yourself for once." She left briefly and returned with a folded blanket and one of her late husband's old flannel shirts, worn, soft, still carrying traces of a life lived with kindness. The veteran hesitated when she handed it to him. "I can't wear this. It belonged to—" "He'd have wanted someone to use it," she interrupted. "Someone good." He looked at her for a moment, something unspoken flickering in his eyes, then nodded slowly. Margaret stepped back to give him privacy. When he emerged from the hallway a few minutes later, wearing the flannel shirt, it hung loose on his frame, but somehow it suited him, as if it had been waiting all this time for someone who needed it. They sat again, letting the quiet settle between them like a warm blanket. The fear of the night before felt distant now, like a nightmare fading with dawn. But the emotional weight lingered, less painful, more transformative. Margaret stood and walked to the window. The clouds were beginning to lift, revealing faint streaks of silver morning light cutting through the fog. "You should rest," she said softly. "You're safe here." He rubbed the back of his neck, uncertain. "I should be on my way once the rain stops. I didn't mean to trouble you more than I already have." Her heart tightened. The thought of him stepping back out into the world, alone, tired, carrying all that pain with him, felt unbearable. She turned to face him fully. "You didn't trouble me," she said. "You protected me. You saved my life." She hesitated, then added quietly, "And maybe that means something. Maybe you're meant to be here." He looked down, fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "Ma'am, people don't keep me around long. I've learned that much." Margaret walked toward him. Each step was small, but her resolve was strong. She gently placed a hand on his forearm. "Well, maybe this time is different." He lifted his gaze slowly. In his eyes was a mixture of disbelief and longing, the longing of a man who hadn't been invited to stay anywhere in years. The warmth of her touch eased something inside him, something so tightly wound he hadn't realized how much it hurt. He swallowed hard. "Margaret," his voice cracked, "I don't know where I belong anymore." She gave him a small, trembling smile. "Then why not start here, just for another night or two? No expectations, no demands, just a warm fire, a quiet home, and someone who's glad you're alive." His breath hitched, not from physical pain, but from the shock of hearing words he never imagined would be offered to him at this age, in this condition, after this life. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "I am." The room fell silent again, but not the kind of silence born from fear or loneliness. This was a peaceful silence, a healing silence. Outside, the sun began to push through the clouds, casting a pale golden glow over the horizon. The storm had passed. The world felt softer, calmer, almost new. The veteran looked at Margaret with something close to reverence, as if she had not only opened her door to him, but given him a reason to keep walking through life. "All right," he said finally, voice fragile but sincere. "I'll stay." Margaret nodded, tears filling her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. And as the first true light of morning touched the windows, two people who had braved the worst night of their lives in very different ways found something neither expected. A beginning. Not loud, not dramatic, but quietly, beautifully hopeful. A beginning born from a knock at the door, and the courage to open it.